In 1853, a steamboat captain paid $300 for 15,000 acres of South Texas desert that nobody wanted. By the time his family was done, they owned more land than the entire state of Rhode Island, 1.2 million acres, and had invented a breed of cattle, won the Triple Crown, struck oil on the largest private lease in American history, and inspired the novel that became the James Dean movie Giant. The name was King Ranch, and for a century it was the most powerful private kingdom in the United States. The founder's deathbed command to his family was 5 words long: never sell a foot. Every generation since has nearly gone bankrupt trying to obey it. The brand they burned onto those first longhorns in 1869 was a simple mark, a curving W, like a wave or a rattlesnake in motion. The Kineños, the Mexican cowboys who worked the ranch from the beginning, called it La Viborita, the little snake. Nobody knows exactly what Richard King intended when he chose it, but the running W became one of the most recognized symbols in the American West, and following it from its first sizzle on a longhorn hide to where it appears today tells you everything about what happened to this place. Richard King was born in 1824 or 1825, even that much is uncertain, in New York City, to Irish immigrants so poor that their names have been lost to history. At the age of 8 or 9, depending on the source, he was indentured to a jeweler in Manhattan. The boy hated it. He ran away, stowed aboard a steamship bound for Mobile, Alabama, and was discovered below decks. Rather than throw him overboard, the crew took him on as a cabin boy. A captain named Joe Holland took a liking to him, sent him to school in Connecticut for 8 months, the entirety of Richard King's formal education, and then put him back on the river. By 16, King was a licensed steamboat pilot. By 22, he had volunteered for the Seminole War in Florida, where he met Mifflin Kennedy, a Quaker-raised Pennsylvanian, 6 years his senior. Kennedy would become his lifelong partner, and the only man Richard King consistently trusted. In 1847, the Mexican War pulled both men to the Rio Grande. King piloted the transport Colonel Cross, ferrying troops and supplies between Matamoros, Reynosa, and Camargo. When the shooting stopped, he stayed. He and Kennedy and 2 other partners formed M. Kennedy and Company in 1850, a steamboat firm that achieved what historians call nearly monopolistic control of trade on the Rio Grande for the next 2 decades. They ran goods, passengers, and cotton up and down a river that was the border between 2 countries and the lifeline of a region. The profits were enormous. But King looked at his steamboats and saw something most people miss about machines. Land and livestock have a way of increasing in value, he told Kennedy. Cattle and horses, sheep and goats will reproduce themselves into value. But boats, they have a way of wrecking, decaying, falling apart. That observation, combined with a piece of advice from an Army officer stationed in Texas at the time, changed the course of South Texas history. The officer was Robert E. Lee. What he told King was simple: buy land and never sell. In the spring of 1852, King rode north from the Rio Grande toward Corpus Christi, crossing a blasted stretch of brush and sand called the Wild Horse Desert, El Desierto de los Muertos, the Desert of the Dead. After more than 100 miles without fresh water, he reached Santa Gertrudis Creek. Grass grew along its banks. Wild mustangs drank from its pools. King saw what nobody else in Texas bothered to see. This was cattle country, if you could survive it. That summer, he bought his first parcel, 15,500 acres of a defunct Spanish land grant for $300, partnering with a man named Gideon K. Lewis. Lewis was murdered within a year. King was on his own. He needed cattle, and he needed men who knew cattle. In 1854, with a drought ravaging northern Mexico, King rode to the village of Cruillas in the state of Tamaulipas. He bought every head of livestock the villagers owned, scrawny, thirsty cattle going for as little as $5 a head. Then he started driving them north, and somewhere on the trail a few miles out of town, Richard King stopped. He turned his horse around. He had realized something. By buying their cattle, he had bought the only thing keeping those people alive. He rode back and made them a proposition. Come work on my ranch. I will give you food, shelter, and wages for as long as the ranch exists. Most of the village said yes. They loaded their families onto carts and walked north into Texas with a steamboat captain who knew nothing about ranching. These were the first Kineños, los Kineños, King's people. They were already expert horsemen and cattlemen, raised in the hard Mexican range country. They knew how to rope in brush so thick a horse could barely turn around. They knew how to read the temperament of a half-wild longhorn from the way it held its head. And they stayed. Their children stayed. Their grandchildren stayed. The Kineños became the most important cowboys in Texas history, the ones who actually built the King Ranch with their hands. And most Americans have never heard of them. Some families worked the ranch for 6 generations. The arrangement between King and the Kineños was modeled on the old Spanish hacienda system that had governed this land for centuries before Texas was Texas. The patron owned the land, provided for his people, and expected loyalty and labor in return. It was feudal in every sense, paternalistic, hierarchical, bound by mutual obligation rather than by contract. Some of the early Kineños rose to positions of authority: caporals, the foreman who ran the daily work; mayordomos, who oversaw non-cattle operations; remuderos, who managed the horse herds. These were Spanish titles carried forward on an American ranch, used without irony well into the 20th century. The system produced extraordinary loyalty. It also produced a world in which several hundred families lived entirely at the discretion of one. In 1858, King built the first permanent ranch house at Santa Gertrudis, on a spot recommended by his friend Robert E. Lee, a site chosen for its tactical advantages, protected by a creek gully with clear sight lines in every direction. Lee thought like a soldier. King thought like a man who expected to be attacked, because he often was. Raiders, rustlers, and bandits from both sides of the border struck regularly in those early years. The ranch was a fortress as much as a home. While King accumulated land, more than 60 separate purchases over his lifetime, his steamboat money kept flowing. He hired lawyers to track down the owners of old Spanish and Mexican land grants across South Texas, bought them out parcel by parcel, and annexed each piece to the ranch. He learned early about the pitfalls of fraudulent titles when he purchased a bogus claim to the southern half of Padre Island in 1852. And after that, he insisted on clean documentation for every acre. His partner, Charles Stillman, the founder of Brownsville, was part of the steamboat operation, and together with Kennedy, the 3 men controlled trade along the lower Rio Grande with an iron grip. During the Civil War, King and Kennedy placed their 22-boat fleet under Mexican registry and flew Mexican flags to dodge the Union blockade. Kennedy ran the boats from the Gulf to Rio Grande City. King managed the ranch and operated salt works on the coast. Their steamers ferried Confederate cotton from Texas downriver to Matamoros, where it was loaded onto foreign vessels at the coastal port of Baghdad, Mexico, a dusty village that during the war became one of the busiest shipping points in the Western Hemisphere. In return, they brought back guns, ammunition, medical supplies, clothing, shoes, and coffee, goods the Confederacy could not get any other way. The King Ranch itself became a major way station on the Cotton Road, the trail that connected Texas plantations to the Mexican border. The ranch had water, food, fresh mules, oxen, and bunks for the drivers hauling cotton south. King and Kennedy were supply agents for the Rio Grande Military Sub-District. It was a lucrative arrangement. Both men made fortunes that dwarfed anything the steamboat business had produced in peacetime. It also made the ranch a target. The concentration of goods at Santa Gertrudis tempted bandits from both sides of the border, and it drew the attention of Union commanders seeking to break up the Cotton Road and seize the beef, cotton, and horses for their planned invasion of Texas. On December 23, 1863, after Union forces captured Brownsville, a party of 80 soldiers under Captain James Speed rode north to raid King Ranch. King was in Mexico at the time, searching for stolen cattle. Henrietta, his wife since 1854, the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, was at the house with their children, pregnant with their 5th child. The soldiers fired on the structure. A ranch hand named Francisco Alvarado ran toward the soldiers, waving his arms, trying to warn them that women and children were inside. They shot him dead. The troops ransacked the property, seized the ranch workers as prisoners, and searched for King, whom they did not find. Henrietta gathered the children and eventually fled to San Antonio, where she remained until the Confederates under Colonel John S. Rip Ford reclaimed South Texas in 1864. After the war, King received a presidential pardon from Andrew Johnson and returned to the ranch. He and Kennedy amicably divided their joint holdings in 1869. Kennedy bought the 115,000-acre Laurellis grant for his own operation, and the two remained friends and allies for life. Each man needed a new brand for his separate herd. Kennedy chose a laurel leaf. King chose the running W. Nobody recorded why. The post-war years were violent. Between 1866 and 1869, King reported the loss of 34,000 cattle to Mexican rustlers and hide peelers who slaughtered animals just for their skins and left the carcasses to rot. He built a 75-foot watchtower on the ranch and kept 4 Dahlgren boat howitzers, naval guns designed for ships, primed and ready to fire at raiders. But the economics of the post-war cattle trade were irresistible. Northern and eastern cities were filling with millions of immigrants who needed to eat. A longhorn steer worth $5 in South Texas could sell for $40 at the Kansas railheads. King's herds, marked with the newly registered Running W brand, were among the first Texas cattle to be driven north in the great trail drives of the 1870s. By the early 1880s, the Running W was as well known as any brand from the Gulf of Mexico to Abilene. Then came the blow that nearly ended everything. In 1883, King's 19-year-old son, Robert E. Lee King, named for the man who gave his father the advice that shaped his life, died of pneumonia. Richard King was devastated. By some accounts, he began drinking heavily. He actually listed the ranch for sale, asking a British syndicate for $6.5 million. The syndicate walked away. King was left with a 600,000-acre ranch, mounting debts, and no heir. On April 14, 1885, he died of stomach cancer at the Menger Hotel in San Antonio. A legend persists that his ghost still wanders the room where he took his last breath. What is certain is what he said to his family before he died: never sell a foot. Henrietta King inherited roughly 500,000 acres and $500,000 in debt, almost exactly $1 of obligation for every acre of land. She was 52 years old. She made one decision immediately. She hired Robert Justus Kleberg, a young lawyer of Prussian descent who had beaten her husband in a minor lawsuit in Corpus Christi a few years earlier. King had recognized the man's talent and put him on retainer. Now Henrietta gave Kleberg full authority to manage the ranch. Within a year, Kleberg married her youngest daughter, Alice. The family and the empire fused. What Henrietta King did over the next 40 years is extraordinary by any standard. She and Kleberg paid off Richard's debts, not by selling land, but by selling cattle and running the operation with relentless discipline. They sold some peripheral acreage to cover the most pressing obligations, but the core holdings, Santa Gertrudis, Laurellis, Norias, and Sino, were untouched. By 1895, the ranch had grown to 650,000 acres and was engaged in experiments that would have seemed absurd to the cowboys of the 1850s: scientific cattle breeding, irrigated farming, and systematic range grass improvement. Kleberg drilled for artesian water in 1899 and hit it, a breakthrough that transformed what the desert could support. He attacked the cattle tick that was devastating Texas herds, pioneering the dipping vat systems that became industry standard and probably saved the South Texas cattle business. By the turn of the century, the ranch was running some of the best livestock in the state. But Henrietta understood something that pure ranchers often miss. Infrastructure creates value. 1 million acres of land meant nothing if you could not get the cattle to market. Around 1900, she and Kleberg began lobbying for a railroad to connect South Texas to the rest of the country. The politics were delicate. Other ranchers wanted the line too, and nobody wanted to give up the land it required. Henrietta solved the problem with characteristic directness. She donated a large tract of King Ranch land, half of it deeded outright to the Johnston Brothers Construction Company, to induce the St. Louis, Brownsville, and Mexico Railway to lay tracks through her property. In 1903, Kleberg organized the Kleberg Town and Improvement Company, became president of the new railroad, and hired a surveyor to plat a town site 3 miles east of the ranch headquarters. On July 4, 1904, the railroad's inaugural passenger train ran from Brownsville to Corpus Christi, and the town of Kingsville was born. Henrietta and Kleberg did not wait for settlers to build the town. They built it themselves. A hotel, an ice plant, waterworks, a cotton gin, a weekly newspaper, a lumber company. After considerable lobbying, railroad officials decided to locate their division headquarters in Kingsville, and by 1906, 25 permanent railroad employees and their families had moved in. By 1912, the population was 4,000. By 1931, 500 people worked for the railroad alone, making up 1/3 of the town's residents. Henrietta donated land for Baptist, Methodist, Episcopal, Catholic, and Presbyterian churches. She built a public high school and gave it to the town. She provided the land and the funds for what became South Texas State Teachers College, now Texas A&M University, Kingsville. She helped establish the Spohn Sanitarium in Corpus Christi. She invested in the Kingsville Ice and Milling Company, the Kingsville Power Company, and the Gulf Coast Gin Company. She was, in effect, building a civilization around her ranch, and she was doing it with the profits from the ranch itself. By the time Henrietta King died on March 31, 1925, at the age of 92, the ranch covered more than 1.2 million acres and ran roughly 125,000 head of cattle. She was one of the richest women in the world. At her funeral, 200 Kineños rode their quarter horses in a procession to the gravesite. Each man cantered once around the open grave, hat held at his side, and rode away. It was a gesture that said more about what King Ranch was: a feudal world, a self-contained country, a place where loyalty was inherited, than any eulogy could. And then the bills came due. Henrietta's death triggered estate taxes, complicated divisions among heirs, and the immediate question of who was actually in charge. Her son-in-law, Robert Kleberg Sr., died in 1932, and by then the Great Depression had driven beef prices to the lowest of the century. The ranch owed $3 million. It was still over 1 million acres, still running 94,000 cattle and 4,500 horses, but the math was brutal. Into this crisis stepped Robert Justus Kleberg, Jr., Bob Kleberg, Richard King's grandson, the man who would rule King Ranch for the next 4 decades and become one of the most remarkable, most autocratic, and most consequential figures in American agricultural history. Bob Kleberg understood that the ranch could not survive on cattle alone. He did 2 things that changed everything. First, on September 26, 1933, he signed the largest oil and gas lease ever negotiated for private land in the United States. The lessee was Humble Oil and Refining Company, the firm that would eventually become Exxon. Under the deal, Humble got exclusive drilling rights across 825,000 acres. In return, King Ranch got an annual bonus of 13 cents per acre, a 1/8 royalty on every barrel produced, and, crucially, a $3.5 million loan that erased the estate tax debt. The first well came in on the ranch in 1939. Drilling was modest until 1945, when the Boregas oil field was discovered in southeastern Jim Wells County, and then the floodgates opened. By 1947, Humble operated 390 producing wells on King Ranch land. By 1953, the number was 650. Over the decades, more than 3,700 wells would be drilled. By 1994, the ranch had collected more than $1 billion in petroleum royalties since World War II. The second thing Bob Kleberg did was invent an animal. For years, the ranch had struggled with a fundamental problem. British cattle breeds like Shorthorns and Herefords produced fine beef, but could not tolerate the brutal South Texas heat, the biting insects, the drought. Indian Brahman cattle could handle the climate, but produced inferior meat. Kleberg's father had begun crossing the two lines, and around 1910, a half-Brahman, half-Shorthorn bull given to the ranch by a neighboring rancher named Thomas O'Connor had jumped a fence into a pasture of 3,000 Shorthorn heifers. One of the resulting calves showed promise. Kleberg intensified the program. In 1920, a deep red bull calf was born from a carefully planned mating of Brahman and Shorthorn bloodlines. Because of his playful behavior, they named him Monkey. Monkey proved to be a genetic miracle. His offspring were uniformly hardy, heat-tolerant, tick-resistant, and heavy with meat. In 1940, the United States Department of Agriculture officially recognized the Santa Gertrudis as the first new breed of beef cattle developed in the Americas. It was 3/8 Brahman, 5/8 Shorthorn, and cherry red from nose to tail. Bob Kleberg had done something that had not been accomplished anywhere in the world in more than a century. And he was not done. The ranch's breeding expertise extended to horses. Quarter horses had been part of King Ranch operations from the beginning. The Kineños needed fast, agile mounts to work cattle in the dense South Texas brush. But in 1934, Bob Kleberg entered the thoroughbred business, purchasing a stallion named Shikaro to add genetic quality to the quarter horse line, and then buying thoroughbred mares to develop a racing program. In late 1939, he acquired Bold Venture, the 1936 Kentucky Derby and Preakness winner, and put him to work as a breeding stallion. Bold Venture was crossed with King Ranch mares, and one of the offspring was a chestnut colt born on March 26, 1943, on the ranch itself. As a weanling, the colt stepped on a sharp stake that pierced the front wall of his right forefoot. The injury never fully healed. The hoof wall was so thin that farriers could barely find room to nail on a shoe. When the horse walked or trotted, he moved with an awkward, lurching gait that made people think he was about to fall over. His trainer, the veteran Max Hirsch, watched him closely and noticed something. He never showed any sign that it hurt him, Hirsch said later. When he walked or trotted, you'd think he was going to fall down, but he galloped true. They called him Assault. Assault's first race was a disaster. He finished 12th. He won only 2 of 9 starts as a 2-year-old, one of them the Flash Stakes in a 4-way photo finish at starting odds of 70-1. Nobody outside the King Ranch barn took him seriously. At the 1946 Kentucky Derby, the smart money was elsewhere. But on the first Saturday in May, Assault, the club-footed comet, bred and raised on a cattle ranch in the South Texas brush country, a horse that looked like he could barely walk, won the Kentucky Derby. 2 weeks later, he won the Preakness. 3 weeks after that, he won the Belmont Stakes to sweep the Triple Crown, only the 7th horse in history to do it. He remains the only Texas-bred horse ever to win the Triple Crown. His career earnings totaled $675,470, serious money in 1946. 4 years later, another King Ranch horse, Middle Ground, also sired by Bold Venture, won both the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont Stakes. When Robert Kleberg, Jr. accepted the August Belmont Memorial Cup at the 1946 ceremony, He said simply, "We're deeply happy, and we feel others will agree with us now that a Salt is a great horse." The running W, which had been on longhorn hides and fence posts and branding irons for 77 years, was now on the winning jockey's silks at the most famous horse race in America. This was King Ranch at its absolute zenith. Oil money pouring in, a new cattle breed recognized worldwide, a Triple Crown winner, and then another. International operations expanding into Brazil, Argentina, Australia, Spain, and Morocco. Ranches on 4 continents, all exporting Santa Gertrudis genetics to hot climates where conventional European cattle could not survive. In Australia alone, the Santa Gertrudis would become the country's most prevalent beef breed. Bob Kleberg also purchased a thoroughbred farm outside Lexington, Kentucky, on property that had once been part of Colonel E.R. Bradley's legendary Idle Hour farm. He acquired holdings in Pennsylvania, Florida, and Mississippi. The King Ranch name carried weight from Kingsville to Buenos Aires. Kleberg received heads of state and movie stars on the porch of the main house, a 37,000-square-foot, 27-room Mediterranean-style structure that had been completed in 1915 after the previous plantation house burned to the ground on January 4, 1912. Henrietta King, then in her 80s, had overseen its replacement. Designed by the architectural firm Adams & Adams of San Antonio, with interiors by Tiffany Studios of New York, the big house cost $350,000 to build, a staggering sum for South Texas in that era. It had 25 fireplaces, nearly as many bathrooms, a veranda, a grand salon, and a dining hall that could seat 50 guests. Tom Lee, the novelist and muralist who later wrote the authorized history of the ranch, described its architecture as scrambled elements of Mexican, Moorish, and California mission of Long Island and Wild Horse Desert. The building loomed over the surrounding pastures like a feudal castle. In 1961, the United States Department of the Interior listed it as a National Historic Landmark. In 1947, the novelist Edna Ferber showed up. She was already famous for Showboat and Cimarron, and she informed Bob Kleberg that she intended to write a novel about his ranch. Kleberg told her he would prefer she didn't, at least not until he had time to confer on a proper history of the place. He wanted control of the narrative, the way he had control of everything else. Ferber went ahead anyway. She spent long periods at King Ranch doing research, absorbing the scale of the place, studying the family dynamics, the oil money, the Mexican workers, the racial tensions of post-war South Texas. She watched how the King-Kleberg family moved through their domain, part landed gentry, part industrial magnates, wholly convinced that their way of life was not only justified, but heroic. The result was Giant, published in 1952. The fictional Riata Ranch and its patriarch, Jordan Benedict II, were transparently modeled on King Ranch and Bob Kleberg. The novel laid bare the feudalism, the racial hierarchy, the overwhelming vanity of building a private empire in the middle of a democracy. The Kleberg family was furious. Helen Groves, Bob's daughter and Richard King's great-granddaughter, reportedly never forgave Ferber. Decades later, the mere mention of the novelist's name in her presence could produce a visible reaction. In 1956, the novel became the George Stevens film, starring Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, and James Dean, a movie that cemented King Ranch in the American mythological landscape, whether the family liked it or not. But myth is a poor substitute for a succession plan, and Bob Kleberg had none. He ran King Ranch for 56 years as a benevolent autocrat, the boss to everyone on the property. Every major decision, from which bulls to breed to which heads of state to invite for quail hunts, went through him. The Kineños loved him. The family deferred to him. The ranch operated like a medieval estate with a birth-to-death social welfare system for its workers. Housing, food, medical care, education, and a guarantee that your children would have jobs too. 700 Kineños and their families lived on the ranch in tidy white frame houses clustered near the division headquarters. On October 13, 1974, Bob Kleberg died. He was 78. 56 years of enlightened despotism had left the ranch singularly dependent on one man, and when that man was gone, the machinery of empire immediately began to creak and then to fail. The problem was structural, and it was the oldest problem in the history of dynasties. Bob Kleberg had consolidated power so completely that no one remaining had the authority, the knowledge, or the stature to replace him. He had been manager, visionary, geneticist, diplomat, and patriarch all at once. His successors were a committee. And the Kleberg diaspora, by now scattered across Texas, educated at places like Deerfield Academy, Cornell, and Stanford, sitting on the boards of AT&T and Campbell Soup and major Texas banks, had very different ideas about what King Ranch owed them. James H. Clement became CEO after Kleberg's death, but the battles of succession had already begun. Belton Kleberg Johnson, Richard King's great-grandson, had been passed over for the top job back in the 1950s. He sold his interest in the ranch in 1976, but kept his royalty interests in the oil, a distinction that would matter enormously later. Then Alice Kleberg Reynolds, another disaffected heir, came forward requesting a buyout for $35 million. The ranch did not have that kind of cash. It had to borrow $100 million, mortgaging the home ranches to the hilt, for the first time since the humble oil deal rescued them in 1933. The buyouts were just the beginning. Oil and gas royalties had peaked at roughly $100 million in 1979, and the money had been flowing through the corporate structure in ways that certain family members found unsatisfactory. Lawsuits followed. Some heirs argued that the ranch had failed to police Exxon's operations and had lost revenue as a result. The upshot was that the mineral rights, the oil money that had been floating the entire operation for 40 years, were spun out of the corporation and distributed directly to the heirs. The ranch kept the land. The family kept the oil. It was the financial equivalent of separating a man's skeleton from his muscles. The ranch now had $100 million in debt and no oil revenue to service it. For an agricultural company, that was nearly a death sentence. What followed was the most painful period in King Ranch history. The birth-to-death welfare system for the Kineños had to be dismantled. In the mid-1980s, the ranch's management, including T.O. Kleberg, a family member who oversaw the Santa Gertrudis division and who had devoted his life to the ranch and its people, was ordered to make the cuts. 700 Kineños had been working on the property. T.O. had to look into the faces of men and women whose families had followed Captain Richard King out of Cruia in 1854 and tell them there were no more jobs for them and fewer for their children. Helicopters replaced cowboys. A helicopter could gather a pasture in half a day that once took 30 riders 2 days. In 1988, for the first time in 135 years, King Ranch was run by someone who was not a descendant of Richard King. Darwin Smith, the professional manager, took over as CEO and began restructuring the operation from top to bottom. Unprofitable businesses were sold. Costs were slashed. The headquarters symbolically moved to Houston. Under Smith and his successors, the ranch diversified aggressively. Citrus groves and sod farms in Florida, alfalfa in Arizona, offshore oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico. Revenue climbed from around $100 million in the late 1980s to $183 million by 1994. The ranch survived, but it was no longer the self-contained feudal kingdom it had been under Bob Kleberg. It was a modern agribusiness corporation that happened to own a lot of historically significant land. Today, a visitor to Kingsville drives down Highway 77 past flatbrush country that looks much as it did when Richard King first crossed it in 1852. The town that Henrietta and Robert Kleberg built is still there. The university, the railroad depot built in 1904, the quiet grid of streets named for King and Kleberg family members. The ranch entrance is modest, marked by a gate on the west side of town at the end of Santa Gertrudis Avenue. A 10-mile driving tour loops through a small fraction of the property. You pass the big house, 37,000 square feet of Mediterranean grandeur, still used for family gatherings, still not open to the public. You see some of the 35,000 cattle and 200 quarter horses that remain. If you're lucky, your tour guide is a retired ranch hand with Kineño blood, who can tell you stories his grandfather told him. The running W is still everywhere. It is burned on the flanks of Santa Gertrudis cattle. It is stitched into leather goods sold at the King Ranch saddle shop. It is stamped onto the dashboard of the Ford F-150 King Ranch Edition, which retails for roughly $80,000. A truck designed originally for the ranch, now marketed to suburban Americans who will never rope a calf in their lives. The brand that was registered on February 9, 1869, to mark longhorn cattle being driven to Kansas railheads, is now a luxury trademark managed by corporate licensing agreements. Some of the original Kineño families still live in Kingsville, though most no longer work the ranch. The newspaper and the bank and the radio station and the lumber yard that King Ranch once operated in town are gone. The John Deere dealership survived. The ranch itself remains the largest in the United States, still 825,000 acres, still privately held, still family-owned in the sense that the Kleberg descendants are its stockholders. National Historic Landmark status was conferred in 1961. But the empire, the thing that Richard King began building when he turned his horse back toward Cruaya, the thing that Henrietta doubled, the thing that Bob Kleberg expanded across 4 continents, that empire exists now in a different form. It is no longer a place where an entire community is born, works, and dies under a single brand. It is no longer a private country. It is a very large, very successful, very well-managed piece of real estate with a storied past and a recognizable logo. Richard King died owing $1 for every acre he owned. His wife took on $500,000 in debt rather than sell a foot. His grandson mortgaged everything to Humble Oil and spent 40 years building it into the most famous ranch on earth. His great-grandchildren mortgaged it again to buy each other out, sued each other over the oil money, and watched as helicopters replaced the horsemen whose ancestors had walked out of Mexico with nothing but their skills and a promise. The land is still there. The running W is still there. Whether what it represents, a family's unbroken hold on a piece of the American earth, generation after generation, against every force that modern finance and inheritance law and human nature can throw at it, whether that is still there depends on what you think the brand was ever really marking. On the dining room wall of the big house at Santa Gertrudis, the Triple Crown trophy from 1946 still catches the light. A Salt, the club-footed comet, is buried somewhere out in the pastures where he was foaled. The bull they called Monkey, whose genes created an entirely new breed of cattle, has been dead for the better part of a century. Henrietta King's grave is in Kingsville. Richard King's ghost is said to haunt the Menger Hotel in San Antonio, still pacing the room where he gave his last order. The running W, first pressed into the hide of a longhorn steer on the Wild Horse Desert in 1869, was designed to heal clean and grow with the animal that bore it.